Sustainability Department here at Salem State University. Today's talk is sponsored by Salem State University's Earth Day Committee, the Geography and Sustainability Department, and Sunrise Salem. Today, I'm delighted to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Benjamin Franta. Dr. Franta is a senior research fellow and the founding head of the Climate Litigation Lab at the Oxford Sustainability Law Program in the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment at the University of Oxford. The Climate Litigation Lab is a new multidisciplinary research initiative to inform, supercharge, and accelerate climate litigation globally. Ben holds a JD from Stanford Law School and is a licensed attorney with the California State Bar. He also holds a PhD from Stanford in history and a PhD in applied physics from Harvard, so a very multidisciplinary background, of which we'll talk a little bit about later. His research has appeared in 10 languages, been cited in the US Congressional Record, and published in numerous scholarly and popular venues, including Nature and Climate Change, Global Environmental Change, and The Guardian. Ben's talk today is titled Legal Action for Climate Justice, a Global Movement. Dr. Franta will present for about 35 minutes or so, or thereabouts, whatever works for you, Ben. And then we'll move to Q&A. If members of the audience have a question, please pop it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now without further ado, let's go over to Dr. Franta.
Thank you so much, Noel. And thank you everyone for joining today. It's an exciting day. I'm happy to be here with you. The first thing I want to do is show you a video or share a video of a recent announcement of a climate lawsuit. And that's really what I want to talk about today is climate change lawsuits. As Professor Healy said, I work on research to help inform climate change lawsuits in the US and around the world. And we've seen a lot of developments in this space in the last 6 months even. And even today, we saw a new ruling out from the European Court of Human Rights about climate change, which we'll talk about more later. But first I want to show you this because I think it's a really interesting illustration of just how exciting some of the action is that's happening right now. So I'm going to share my screen. And I hope you can see that. So this is from last September, and it's the Attorney General of California, Rob Bonta. He's on the right in this kind of, you see this kind of mid-speaking capture here, but you'll see what he has to say. And then on the left is Governor Gavin Newsom of California, and they're announcing this new lawsuit against the big oil companies for deceiving the public about climate change and causing a lot of damage to the state of California through climate change. And so this is a really important lawsuit. It's worth, probably hundreds of billions of dollars alone, just this one lawsuit. And so let's see what the Attorney General has to say.
Good afternoon, everybody. Rob Bonta, California Attorney General. Excited to be here with our great, courageous, and bold governor and to announce a very important lawsuit that we filed on Friday, late night in San Francisco Superior Court in California, where we are suing some of the biggest fossil fuel industry leaders, big oil, from ConocoPhillips to BP to Chevron, Shell, ExxonMobil, as well as the American Petroleum Institute, in a first of its kind, watershed, historic, unprecedented lawsuit by the biggest state in the nation, the soon to be fourth largest economy in the world, the largest geographic area, and the biggest economy yet to sue these companies for fueling climate change and for lying about it. That is the essence of it. It's that deception, those misleading statements, that falsifying over decades, 60, 70 years, and we have a very detailed complaint full of evidence showing studies that were commissioned and internal memos and internal dialogue where leaders of these big oil companies knew exactly what fossil fuel did to the climate change, the increased heat. They predicted very accurately where we are today. They knew it was coming, and they did it anyway. And they, while they huddled internally and privately and told the truth to one another about the facts and science of climate change, they lied to the rest of the world. And so we have a detailed complaint that has a number of different causes of action. It is the most sweeping complaint thus far to sue these companies for fueling climate change and for deceiving. It has a public nuisance claim. It has a destruction of natural resources claim. It has a number of false and misleading statement and deception claims. It has failure to warn claims in it as well. And the main remedy it seeks is an abatement fund to abate and mitigate the impacts of climate change. As the governor has said many times, as the hots get hotter, as the wets get wetter, the dries get drier, that has impact on people and on natural resources and on our state. And right now, the big oil companies have pushed the costs all onto the people, to the taxpayers and everyday folks who are sick because of the air that they breathe or are suffering because of the heat that they work in, who can't afford insurance or are getting insurance pulled away from them, who are losing their homes, losing their farms. Those are all costs that are externalized, that are borne by the people because of the acts and conducts of big oil companies. So they need to be held accountable. They need to pay for the damage that they caused, that they knew about. They knew. They knew for years. They knew where we would be today. They predicted it accurately. And in their endless pursuit, their unquenchable thirst for billions of dollars of profit year after year, $200 billion last year, they continued to lie so they could profit while the planet burned, California burned, flooded, suffered drought, suffered super storms. So we believe that this is a historic moment. We hope that this will be an inspiration to other states and other entities to get involved, to join us, to sue, to be part of an effort to hold an industry accountable that has not been held accountable for too long. And I just want to end with this. This is personal. This is personal to a lot of us. The governor shared some very personal statements earlier today about one of his children. I have the same experience. I have my oldest daughter told me in high school. She's now 24 years old. I'm going to brag here for a second. She's a professional soccer player. But she told me when she was in high school, she said, "Dad, I love our family. My younger brother, my younger sister, mom and dad, and I want to have a family of my own someday. I've always dreamed about that, but right now I don't think I can, I don't think I should, and I'm not planning on it. I don't think it's responsible to bring a new life into a dying planet." And she's worried whether she's going to have a planet, to have a family to enjoy with. And we have a responsibility to do more. California is doing what we do here, leading, leaning in, being bold, being strong, being aggressive, and holding to account an industry that has not been held to account for too long. So we're happy to answer some questions, but very, very, very proud to be with the governor.
I'm ready to step aside and let's just do Q&A.
Okay, so that's this kind of dramatic announcement of this big lawsuit last fall against the big oil companies. And again, these are companies like BP, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, Shell, Chevron, and also the big trade association that all of these companies are a part of, which is called the American Petroleum Institute. And so, this is a really interesting development. I called this talk "Legal Action for Climate Justice, a Global Movement," because that's what we're seeing. We're seeing not just lawsuits like this, but different kinds of lawsuits all over the world seeking different kinds of justice for climate change. And one reason I really like working in this space is because it's motivating. It's very proactive. It's something that people aren't just sitting back and waiting for climate change to happen or wondering, kind of what can we do about it. They're actually taking action, and that's, I think, really empowering and really motivating. It's one reason I think it's really interesting to learn about this and maybe even get involved with it and work in it. So I'm going to share some slides that sort of gives an overview of where we're at in this space and what some of the evidence that's driving these lawsuits. So I'll share that. Here we go. Get this. There we go. Amazing. So let's get started. Here's that video. And so if we share the slides later, you'll be able to watch that video again if you want, and in full, because the governor of California also talks afterwards, and it's very interesting. So I'm just going to talk about 3 things, and I want to leave a lot of room for Q&A and discussion at the end as well. So the state of climate lawsuits today, this historical cover-up, which the Attorney General alluded to or mentioned, but some of the evidence that is sort of forming that historical evidence basis. And then what we're seeing today, we're seeing a lot of greenwashing, and we're seeing a lot of climate damage. And that's sort of the state of play today, and these lawsuits are also trying to address those things. So let's look at the overview of climate lawsuits. We just talked about California. That's just one of more than 24 lawsuits across the United States that are targeting the oil and gas companies. They're shown on this map here. These are lawsuits by governmental entities, so states and cities and counties. And you can see they're spread out all over the place. The city of Chicago just filed, I think a week or 2 ago, so that's another one to add to the list. And we see a lot of these are coastal, but not all coastal. And some are kind of noteworthy, and I'll speak to those. If we zoom out and look at the whole world, we see climate lawsuits all over the place. A lot of them in the US. So here we see these bubbles, and the size of the bubble corresponds with how many climate lawsuits there have been. And this is going back all the way to 1986. So it might surprise you. It surprised me to learn that actually there were climate-related lawsuits happening all the way back in the 1980s and through the 90s, although there weren't that many. I mean, there were like 1 or 2 a year. There are more and more climate lawsuits into the 2000s, and that's shown on the bottom part of this graphic here. But what isn't really shown in the graphic, but which I'll just tell you, is that around the year 2015 or 2016, that's when we start to see a different kind of climate lawsuit. These new lawsuits are based on this historical evidence of what the fossil fuel companies knew about climate change many decades ago. And that is giving a sort of new flavor to the lawsuits, and it's making them more like tobacco lawsuits, or these maybe even the opioid lawsuits, or right now there's litigation happening against the vaping company. So it's kind of this corporate accountability type of a lawsuit, rather than just purely an environmental one. And so that's giving a new flavor to the lawsuits. Different kinds of lawyers are getting involved. There's a lot of money at stake now with these sorts of lawsuits. So I think we're seeing this sort of new wave and a new energy in this space in the last 5 or 6 years. But anyway, I want to direct your attention to not just these lawsuits in the US, but there are lawsuits in Europe, you see on the map, some in Latin America, and growing lawsuits in Australia and other parts of the world too. So this is a truly global phenomenon. This is another way of looking at the global distribution of cases. This is over 1,500 cases in the US since 1986 related to climate change, and over 2,000 around the world. But you can see how they're spread out. There have been over about 80 in the UK, about 130 in Australia, about 60 in the EU, 40 in Germany alone. So again, it's a global phenomenon. So if we look at a few of these suits, what are they about? So let's look at this one. This is filed by the state of Massachusetts against Exxon, and it's saying that Exxon has deceived the consumers in the state, people buying gasoline, people buying things, about the impacts of the company's products on climate change, saying, don't worry about it. These products are safe. You can buy them. It's not going to hurt the environment. It's not going to hurt you. And also Exxon, we're moving in the right direction, and we're developing clean energy. That's, more or less what this complaint is saying that Exxon's doing, and it's saying, hey, that's deceptive, and Exxon can't do that. And this is from the complaint. It draws this comparison with tobacco. And looking at this tobacco advertisement, it says, considering all I'd heard, I decided to either quit smoking or smoke True, which is a brand of cigarette. So I smoke True cigarettes, and it has this, athletic, healthy person, and today we look at this ad and we see this as obviously misleading, because it's associating smoking cigarettes with this healthy lifestyle. Even though there isn't really a technical lie in that ad, it's just a statement, kind of an opinion statement, but it's misleading because of the overall impression it gives. And that's what a lot of these climate ads from these companies are like as well. And so these lawsuits are using this comparison often of past lawsuits against tobacco companies and so on to make this point. This is another really interesting lawsuit. It's a set of them actually down in Puerto Rico. And it's based on a single event, Hurricane Maria, which hit the island in 2017, caused a lot of damage. And here this lawsuit is seeking recovery of that damage from that hurricane. And it's arguing that climate change made that hurricane worse because it made the sea surface temperatures higher. And so when that hurricane formed, it intensified more rapidly than it would have otherwise. And that means that the people living in Puerto Rico didn't have as much time to prepare for that very intense hurricane. And so they call this rapid intensification of this storm fueled by climate change. And so that's another really interesting case going on there. In Oregon, in the county where Portland, Oregon sits, the county itself is suing the oil companies too, not for a hurricane, but for a heat wave, what they call a heat dome. And there have been scientific studies that show that this heat dome was basically impossible to occur without climate change. And this happened in 2021, and it was really harmful and caused a lot of harm, public health harm, and so on. And so they're suing, kind of similar to that single event-based lawsuit, but this is for a heat dome. In Europe, there are very different kinds of cases happening. Some of these cases are against governments, saying these governments need to make stronger climate policy, and some of those have succeeded. This is a photo from the winning judgment announcement from a case in the Netherlands in 2019, and the court ordered the government of the Netherlands to make stronger climate policy as a matter of law. And then the same strategy was used against Royal Dutch Shell, which was based in the Netherlands at the time. It's since kind of moved out, it seems, in part to escape this judgment. But the court again said, yes, Royal Dutch Shell, the oil company, it needs to reduce its emissions by a huge amount, about 50% by the end of the decade, in line with the Paris Agreement. And so this is a court order for the oil companies, in this case just one, Shell, to move away from fossil fuels. And so that's, enormously important as well. So these cases are being replicated across Europe, and they're hugely important. And they're not for money the way the lawsuits are in the US, but they're for this direct change by these companies, which is really exciting. There are cases going on in international human rights courts. Just today in the European Court of Human Rights, this case brought by elderly Swiss women, arguing that they were especially vulnerable to the impacts of heat waves caused by climate change, and that the Swiss government has a human rights obligation to make stronger climate policy based on that. And I think it was just today or yesterday, just very recently, the court agreed with them and said, yes, actually, this is a human rights issue. In the European Convention of Human Rights, it hooks into that, and there's an obligation based on that, and Switzerland has that obligation. And so, you know, I would expect that we're going to see this argument replicated as well across Europe and other parts of the world. So this is a really impactful ruling out today. And then other courts, like the Inter-American Court of Human Rights based in Costa Rica, that court is creating an advisory opinion on climate change and human rights, saying, you know, what are the obligations of states with respect to human rights here? And so that's also happening right now. So all of these things are happening, and so that's all really exciting. There are all these different kinds of climate lawsuits. There are banks being sued. It's sort of a very creative field where different theories are being tested all the time. So I'll move very quickly because I want to leave time for a lot of discussion and questions. And I'll talk about some of the historical evidence that informs these cases. So all the way back in the 1950s, the oil companies were warned about climate change. And this is a photo from a conference back in 1959. And that's, you know, I mean, this is like before the moon landing. This is before the Beatles got famous. Like, you know, this is a pretty long time ago. And at this conference, which was an oil industry conference, the organizers invited this scientist, Edward Teller, to speak. And if you saw the movie Oppenheimer, Edward Teller was one of the characters in that. He was a physicist who helped develop the hydrogen bomb. And he spoke at this conference to the heads of the oil industry, and he warned them about climate change back in 1959. And he said, this is one of his quotes, basically saying, if fossil fuels continued to be used, then there would be global warming, there would be sea level rise, and the coastal cities would be flooded, and that this was a problem. If we zoom ahead a few decades, by the end of the 70s, some of the oil companies had their own internal research programs that were secret and really sophisticated, focused on climate change. And the best known is Exxon's. This is a document from Exxon from 1982. You can see it says proprietary for company use only. It's called the CO2 greenhouse effect. And it's really detailed, and it shows what Exxon knew about climate change at that time. This is a page from that document. It shows the year from 1960 to 2100, projecting into the future. And it shows Exxon's projection of what the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere would be in parts per million, that's on the left-hand side, and how much global warming would be caused, that's on the right-hand side. So we can go to the year 2024, and it predicts around 420 parts per million CO2 and around 1.1 or so, 1.2 degrees Celsius of global warming. And it's just about exactly right. So, you know, this projection by Exxon back in 1982 was extremely accurate. The company had no doubt that its products would cause climate change ultimately, and it even knew, you know, just about how much. And in terms of the impacts that would cause, here's some of the language from Exxon's report. It talks about potentially catastrophic effects, flooding, climate-related famine and migration, and that adaptation to climate change would cost hundreds of billions of dollars. So, you know, all of this was known by Exxon and many of the other oil companies because this information was shared between the oil companies. Here's another really interesting document, and this was just found less than a year ago by a graduate student in the Netherlands who was doing some research on Shell. So it's kind of a cool example of how students and how academic research can have this huge impact in this area. But this is a report from Shell from 1989. It's called a scenarios report. It's basically Shell imagining what the world could be like in 30 years and then trying to make its business resilient to that possibility. And this one was all about climate change. And here, this is one of the key figures. I know it's kind of blurry because of the scan, but you can still see the main point, which is that if we look on the left-hand side, this box here, it shows the year 1970 to 2050 and how much carbon is emitted each year. That's gigatons carbon on the left-hand side. So that's annual emissions. And it shows two different pathways, two different scenarios. In one, emissions peak around the year 2000 and then they start to go down. And that scenario is called SW, which stands for Sustainable World. The other scenario, emissions just keep going up and up and up, much like they have been. And that's called GM, Global Mercantilism. And on the right hand of the screen here, it shows how much CO2 would build up in the atmosphere as a result of these scenarios. So Sustainable World gives us around 400 parts per million CO2, and the business as usual sort of scenario, it just keeps building up more and more and more. So again, not just Exxon, but Shell also understood there were these options available that with action, a lot of global warming could have been prevented. And here's the language from Shell's report, and I'll just let you read that because it's so powerful. So it talks about enormous impacts on nature, on human societies, on conflict, on refugees, migration. It's really incredible, and this was in Shell's own document. Okay, so around the end of the 1980s, governments actually did try to mobilize to deal with this problem and create public policies to control fossil fuels. And we know, again, from historical research that the oil companies got together and organized themselves to make sure that those efforts didn't succeed and that fossil fuels continued to flow. This is one of the strategy documents that's been recently uncovered from Exxon from 1989. And it's to the board of Exxon, and it's basically about how to stop fossil fuel controls from being effective. And here's one of the really interesting slides. It talks about the ozone hole problem and the chemicals that were depleting the ozone layer that were discovered in the 1970s. And by the end of the 1980s, there were international treaties in place to control those chemicals. And it sort of gives this timeline. It says ozone layer, 1974. Atmospheric chemistry and physics was understood. It was understood that it was from an industrial pollution source. There was a delay between cause and effect, meaning you had to take preemptive action to control the problem, became part of the environmentalist movement, and so on. There's a critical event, which is sort of this computer rendering of a hole in the ozone layer, which really freaked people out. And eventually, there were the Montreal Protocols, which was this international agreement to control the chemicals that deplete the ozone layer, and they're still in effect. And what this Exxon strategist was saying to the board of Exxon was that the exact same thing was happening with fossil fuels already, that the science had already been worked out. It was already understood that this was going to be a serious problem, that preemptive action had to be taken, that the problem was fossil fuels fundamentally, and that there was this critical event, which was sort of a big heat wave in 1988 in the US that galvanized attention on the issue. And so even according to the oil companies, the world was at the almost kind of at the last few steps of figuring out how to address this problem by the end of the 1980s. And the oil industry organized itself to make sure that that didn't succeed, and that that's sort of this climate change denial movement that was created then. And so this plan was sent to oil companies all around the world around the year 1990. And it had these multiple prongs to how to weaken fossil fuel controls. And one was to exaggerate the uncertainty in climate science. Say, we don't know if it's fossil fuels, we don't know if it's actually happening or not, and we need to do more research before we take action. The other prong was to kind of weaponize economics by exaggerating how much it would cost to control fossil fuels and downplay how much global warming itself would cost the world economy. And so they hired their own economic consultants and researchers to make biased studies, and then they promote those to the public. And then the third, which gets less attention, but it's really important, is promoting a set of false solutions. So these would be solutions that would not actually hurt the fossil fuel industry or take away any of its market share, but they would make it look like there was action being taken to address the climate change problem. And so the first few that were identified by the fossil fuel industry in the late 1980s were promoting fossil gas, or natural gas as it's sometimes called, as climate safe, even though it's a fossil fuel, promoting efficiency as kind of an adequate solution to climate change, when it's fine, of course, by itself, but it's not adequate because it doesn't replace fossil fuels, and promoting carbon offsets as a solution to climate change. So, and that might surprise you. Again, it surprised me when I learned that actually carbon offsetting was something that was promoted very, very early on by fossil fuel companies back in the 1980s as a way to justify continued fossil fuel development. And since then, the industry has promoted various other solutions that just simply have not worked. Things like carbon capture, things like hydrogen. And a little known fact about hydrogen is most of it is made from fossil gas, so it's actually a fossil fuel in disguise. Biofuels, which are still part fossil fuel, and things like shifting the blame to consumers, saying people should just carpool more, things like that. So this whole counter movement was created in the 1990s, and we have a lot of documents from that too. Here's one of the membership lists from that. Here's an example of some of the hardcore climate denial that was promoted at that time, just saying climate change doesn't exist, essentially, in publications like the Washington Post. And that's when you start to see climate denial get created as a social phenomenon. But then in the late 90s, something shifted. And right when the tobacco companies started to get in legal trouble around 1997, 1998, for their own history of lying, the oil companies shifted, and instead of continuing to overtly deny the existence of climate change, they said, of course we believe that climate change is real and we're fixing it. And this was sort of their new position, and it's still what they say today. So, back in the late 90s, we start to see ad campaigns like this. This is Shell promoting itself as developing solar energy. BP doing the same thing. This is Chevron saying, it promotes renewable energy, using this, youth imagery, future imagery. This is an ad campaign by Chevron called Will You Join Us? And it portrays Chevron as the leader in clean energy and sustainability, and it's asking the consumer to join them in that effort and say, get a programmable thermostat. Exxon had this algae biofuels campaign for about a decade, even though it never sold any algae biofuels. And we still see ads like this, where this is an ad from Exxon that says it's captured more CO2 than any other company. The problem is that's still not very much at all. And actually, most of that is something that the company has to do while it purifies fossil gas to sell. So it's actually in its fossil fuel manufacturing process. It's not to do with helping climate really at all. So this is also, you know, one could argue misleading. And even some of Exxon's investors have noticed this, that this carbon capture ads, they just investments mostly produce advertising. And they said this advertising blitz lacks any real substance. If we look at what these companies are actually investing in renewables, it's hardly anything at all. These are some of the latest data on that. It's what % of the capital investments from these companies go into renewables versus oil and gas. Chevron, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, 0% in renewables. And all of those ads focused on solar and wind and carbon capture and all of this stuff, promoting the company as renewable, as sustainable, and 0% is going in renewables. The European companies, a little bit more, but it's still the vast majority of the investments are going into oil and gas. And at the same time, they're heavily spending on lobbying against climate policies, and that's something that's been well documented as well. And so now that brings us to the damage part of all of this whole story. And so we're seeing more and more climate damage materializing, and scientifically we're able to quantify how much damage is being caused by climate change in certain ways in certain places. So this is a study that was done around Honolulu in Hawaii, just looking at coastal infrastructure damage. So you can see just how granular it is. This is another study that looked at seawalls across the US and how much it would cost to build seawalls that are necessary. And it came to about $400 billion. So quite a lot of money across the US. You know, more and more studies are finding that actually already climate change costs over $100 billion a year to the US and could cost trillions of dollars a year by the end of the century. And then again, more and more studies have shown that, you know, just heat waves alone since the 1990s, $16 trillion in damages across the world. So the damages are huge. They're absolutely enormous. And scientifically, we're able to quantify them and attribute them to individual companies now, something that will be really useful in these lawsuits. So that brings us to the end, and that's sort of what we do as a group at Oxford in our climate litigation lab. Is we do this sort of research. We build greenwashing databases. We build AI tools for climate litigation. We are about to start a new project to quantify climate damages for climate litigation. And we have about 20 people working with us so far. And so it's a really exciting area at the interface of academic research and legal practice, which hopefully will have a positive impact on helping to solve this climate problem. So I'll leave it there, and I'm excited for any questions you might have and for our discussion. So thank you so much.
That's great. Thanks very much, Ben. Yeah, that was a really fantastic breakdown of the global landscape of climate litigation. And as all our audience know, we're really in a critical decade. But nation states, subnational governments are failing to adopt and implement sufficient mitigation policies and pollution cuts. And this has given rise to all these new and innovative forms of national and subnational litigation cases. And I think your talk did a really good job at clarifying the early knowledge, which is very frustrating, I'm sure, for all our audience as well, and the subsequent disinformation campaigns of the oil industry and how they've pivoted to more greenwashing tactics. But yeah, this was great. So we've a lot to talk about. We've got a good few questions coming in, but first, more so just your multidisciplinary background. So you've a pretty unique background that spans the physical sciences, law, and history. And I'm interested to know, how has this interdisciplinary approach informed your perspective in climate litigation? So, you know, could you explain a little bit how your understanding of the history of science has shaped your approach to climate litigation.
Sure. Thanks so much for that. I mean, I had a long and winding path through academia and different kinds of disciplines, essentially searching for, how could I make the biggest impact on climate change and using, what approach? And, it's different for everyone. When I found litigation, I found something that I really liked, because it was practical and it could also be informed using these different academic disciplines. I think the this field, it's very interesting because it requires that blending of different types of evidence. So, I talked about the historical evidence, that's really key. And so the historical and the social science research and the investigative reporting essentially that's gone on, that's been absolutely key for the success of these lawsuits. At the same time, so has the scientific research on climate impacts and climate attribution science and things like that. And so, I'm a huge fan of multidisciplinary approach to problems in that it allows us to identify what the problem is and then not be bound within a certain tool set. So we can think, okay, what does it take to succeed in the lawsuit? Well, we need this kind of evidence, we need that kind of evidence, and those might be in vastly different fields, but we can still, we can do those things and bring together the team, and it's always a team effort to be able to do those different things and work together and communicate across disciplines. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so your recent co-authored paper in Earth's Future, which is really helpful for my students as well, highlighted the critical role of climate change detection and attribution science in clarifying these causal links that are necessary for successful climate litigation. And this seems to be a pivotal aspect of developing strong legal cases. So, within that realm, what do you think are the most pressing research needs that need to be that can support effective climate litigation, and how can they be met? So what is the role of researchers in helping these types of legal cases?
For sure. Well, one of the areas, like you mentioned, is climate change attribution science, which is basically the causation part, how you prove that something was caused by climate change. And then you figure out, well, how much damage was caused, and if you can figure out how much of that is attributable to that company over there, or even that government, if it's a suit against a government, say. And so we're right at the cusp of being able to do that now in the field. And I think in the next few months, maybe 6 months, but maybe even few months, we're going to see some papers published that do exactly that, that look in a geographic area, could be a state, and say, here's how much damage is caused from this impact, could be extreme heat, over this time period, over the last, say, 20 years. And that's caused by that company. So ExxonMobil caused $100 billion of that damage. Chevron caused $80 billion of that damage. Shell caused this much of that damage. And so being able to do that and then do it for sea level rise, and then do it for wildfires, and then do it for drought and agricultural losses, getting down to that level of detail and saying, that company caused that much damage. And by the same token, that government, say, caused that much damage. That I think is going to be key. And that won't just be key for lawsuits, that's going to be key for all of our understanding of the problem and the politics of the problem, the public communications around the problem, even the international negotiations around reparations, international reparations. That's going to be key as well. If a country can say, hey, I know, that country there, their emissions caused this much damage in my country, that should be known, and that should be widely available. That should be democratized knowledge, because it's a huge injustice for that to be concealed or kind of clouded or made available only to some people. And that's sort of the other part of this, what's needed. It's not just the scientific advance, it's having this information available not just for California, but for people all around the world, so that countries and communities all around the world can know, oh, this is how much harm we have experienced because of this, and that empowers them to take whatever action they might feel is appropriate, whether that's international negotiation or legal action or something else. But that sort of broader coverage, democratizing the knowledge globally.
So there's like the challenge is bridging this gap between scientific expertise and legal arguments in the courtroom, and I can imagine that is fun but also really challenging. So have you got any kind of general advice, like hypothetically, for lawyers who are incorporating scientific evidence like this in climate litigation? Like, what are the kind of things that they would have to think through?
Yeah, so I think there's good news for both the lawyers and the scientists. The good news for the lawyers is that a lot of this information that maybe they assume it doesn't exist or it's impossible to obtain, actually the scientists have figured out how to do that often already. And I've talked to many lawyers who have said, oh, I wish we could show this, but that must be impossible to show. And often it's not. It's often it's been published on, but it might be in journals that those lawyers aren't reading. And so the evidence is already there often for these cases. And then the good news on the scientist side is that, sometimes scientists assume that they have to figure out every single detail in order for it to matter for a lawsuit. But it's actually not the case. The law prioritizes resolution of a problem. It doesn't need to know every single little detail in order to have a case be adjudicated. So actually the law, it tends to move forward on the best evidence that's available at the time. If it can, especially if it's peer reviewed and it's generally accepted as good methodology in the field and things like that, then it'll move forward with that. So I think, there's actually good opportunity here to bring those communities together and operationalize that science that's been developed in a legal way.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned today in the European Court of Human Rights, they issued a landmark ruling in its first climate cases. So for the first time, an international tribunal has ruled that a country's failure to take adequate action on climate change is a violation of human rights. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about how this decision might resonate in courts around the world, or what are some of the potential implications of this?
Well, I think it absolutely will. For years we've seen these human rights petitions and actions, not yet at this high of a level. Often these are human rights committees that might give an opinion that says, yes, there are human rights implications from climate change to youth, for example, but never a judgment from an international human rights court saying this country violated human rights obligations for failure to take stronger action on climate change. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty profound, because it's a pretty replicable argument. This case is against Switzerland, but Switzerland is not alone at all in its failure to take action. In fact, it's probably almost every country that is in the same situation. So I would expect to see this is leveraged and built upon in many different countries, probably not the US directly, because the US doesn't really participate in the international human rights legal system much, the way other countries do. It's just the way the legal system works in the US. But the constitutional rights cases in the US are kind of parallel to that, and they'll continue. And there have been some successes there. So again, I think this is a pretty big deal, and I think it's gonna give the domestic courts in those countries the authority they need to say, yeah, this our country's national climate policy is inadequate and it violates human rights, and it needs to be strengthened. And so I think it's going to just give a lot of force to that argument going forward.
I'm going to jump back and forth with some questions. So there's a question from anonymous attendee. Could be one of my students, but it's a good question. So the question is, how successful do you see climate litigation being towards big oil companies? How do we know that they won't just find a way to circumvent it? For example, in the Netherlands, the lawsuit forced a company to cut emissions by 50%. But what is the enforcement going to look like? Or I guess, yeah, how do we know that big oil won't just do the usual tricks that have been applied by tobacco or other sectors that were getting sued for the harms of their products?
It's a great question. Presumably, the oil companies will try everything they can to avoid paying large liability. I mean, that's sort of normal. And so it'll be up to the litigants to try to outmaneuver them and try to ensure that they actually pay should those cases be successful. So that will be something, it'll be a key strategic part of those cases should they go forward. And we're at a critical juncture right now in those cases because they are set to go forward to trial in various states across the country. And the oil companies have appealed to the Supreme Court, essentially appealing on the very heart of the matter, essentially, whether these cases should proceed in state court. And we don't know if the Supreme Court will take that up or not. So we're going to find out, I think, in the next half a year or so. And that'll be a very important juncture for the cases. But it's a great question. And the short answer is,
We'll see soon.
yeah, it's to be seen, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a very exciting case with all the pending cases and existing cases, and the rulings coming today, and the field of climate litigation is really evolving rapidly. It must be an exciting field to be in. And particularly it's changed, and you showed in your presentation how it's transformed over the last decades. So my question is, what are some of the most significant trends in climate litigation, or that you anticipate to emerge over the next few years, or where do you see it going?
Yeah, well, I think this human rights trend is going to continue to grow, and I don't know what impact that will have on companies, because international human rights law traditionally focuses on the obligations of states, of countries, towards their own citizens, essentially. So we'll see what happens with that. They could have trickle-on effects, but I think the whole framing of climate change as a human rights issue in the first place is going to have profound impacts on just the seriousness of how the problem is taken by courts in general across the world. And then I think another big trend we're going to see, we're going to keep seeing these damages cases in the US, I expect. We're going to keep seeing the cases that seek alignment with the Paris Agreement internationally as well. But I think we're going to start to see damages cases outside the US as well. Because of course we know these climate damaging events are not just happening in the US, they're happening all over the world. And the US has a very powerful tort system that is well set up to have those sorts of lawsuits pursued. Other parts of the world, that's not quite as set up to be quite as on point for those kinds of lawsuits. But I think lawyers are going to start to figure out how to pursue those anyway, internationally. So I think that's going to have a big international climate justice component to it. And that's going to be really interesting to see.
And I imagine that's a real challenge. So you've got the international scope of climate change. There's cross-border issues, multinational corporations, and climate litigation, and how these legal systems across different jurisdictions work together to address those challenges. Yeah, that will be interesting, but also very, tricky, because it's a global problem with varying responses. Is there a historical sector like tobaccos that did get hit hard by litigation, or is there like a model that climate litigation would like to follow, or say, yeah, we would like to, or maybe tell us about, is tobacco the best example, or is there other sectors that did get halted to a certain extent by litigation?
Well, in some sense, this is unprecedented in some ways, although there are analogies, of course. So tobacco is one of the most obvious analogies, basically because you have this long history of corporate knowledge of the harm, cover up, denial campaign, and then exposure of the truth, and sort of a lot of damage was ultimately done, and resolution through lawsuits. And and lawsuits were one of the key tools to expose that truth in the case of tobacco, through legal discovery and so on. Now, what makes this different is that tobacco litigation was never really about stop using tobacco entirely. It was sort of about controlling how tobacco is used. Now, for climate change, we have to replace fossil fuels. And if we don't replace fossil fuels, we can't solve the problem of climate change. So the ultimate outcome here is about a replacement of fossil fuels, not just a control of fossil fuels, but their replacement. And so I think the end state of the problem is different. And so the role of the litigation in getting us closer to that desired end state is also perhaps different. Now, maybe it's as simple as saying this litigation, if it forces the oil companies to pay the full cost of their product, well, then fossil fuels are not going to be nearly as attractive from an economical point of view, and renewables are just going to be much, much more competitive at that point. When that's taken into account, and that's going to accelerate the replacement of fossil fuels. That's maybe part of it. I think also the exposure of what these companies knew and when might also be another big part of this, in basically forcing these companies to own the historical it's world historic damage that will last for centuries, that these companies have knowingly caused over the last 30 to 40 years. And so forcing them to own that forever, for as long as they exist, I think might be part of the solution as well. So we'll see, but I think what is obvious already is that these lawsuits are one of the most powerful forms of leverage that communities have over these oil companies. When these oil companies have so much power in legislatures and in the media and so many other realms, the courts are one of the only places perhaps where these companies don't have a totally dominating sort of power. And so I think that's one reason why these lawsuits are essential to going forward.
Yeah, and I guess we can view them as complementary to all these other types of climate actions, from divestment or boycotting or protesting in the streets and voting in, Green New Dealers into Congress and whatnot. Just one question on litigation in the global South. So in one of your recent quarter papers, you talked about the disparities in geographic scope of climate litigation research, particularly in underrepresented countries in the global South. How do you think this geographic imbalance in research can be addressed? And what role do you see playing this in future climate litigation?
Yeah, I think we need to build more global research networks in this space. Um, a lot of the research is kind of in rich countries, focused on rich countries, and a lot of the lawsuits are driven by the resources that exist in law firms in rich countries, and in some sense that is useful to the cause of fighting climate change because, these law firms now involved in these lawsuits are very powerful and have a lot of resources, and that's good, I think, in a sense, because that allows the side that wants to fight climate change to somewhat get closer to matching some of the power on the incumbent side that wants to slow things down. But there's still this global kind of patchiness or global blind spot sort of issue where most of the worst impacts are occurring in places that are poor, that don't have the resources, and don't have wealthy law firms to take these cases, say. And of course, the whole political situation in many of those places is very different. So if you're environmental journalist, it's very, very dangerous to do that sort of work in many parts of the world. So I don't have a silver bullet answer for that other than we know this is a problem, and we need to build, I think, better research networks across the world is one part of it. But I don't think that can be the only answer because there has to be local power that's built up as well in those places, not just sort of collaborations alone, although collaborations are great.
Yeah. The photo you showed of the smoking kind of greenwashing ad was really interesting, and there's lots of clear analogies to the fossil fuel deception, and it just made me think about how, or wonder, is making the case around greenwashing legally more challenging than an outright denial document or those kind of internal documents that Exxon had? Is that a whole new legal realm? Like, because greenwashing is kind of this subtle issue. It's not. It's kind of more deception rather than outright lies. Maybe could you just share a little bit about greenwashing and what that looks like in terms of climate litigation?
Absolutely. So greenwashing is really heavily focused on in some of the lawsuits, in part because that's the form of climate deception that we see going on today. And many of these lawsuits, they want to focus on what's going on today and maybe over the last 3 to 5 years. Because if all they can point to is something that happened 20 years ago, it's just harder to make that case. And some of the laws have statutes of limitations that say, this should only be, over the last 3 years or something. So a lot of the greenwashing is very front and center in the cases. Now, it's right that a lot of it is subtle. It's what we call true but misleading. It's basically saying, here's something that's like literally true, but it's leaving out a whole bunch of context. And a great one is Exxon saying, we captured more CO2 than any other company. Okay, that could literally be true. But the context is, here's how much CO2 our fossil fuels emitted. Here's how much we captured. Still, it's almost nothing compared to that. That's an important piece of context. And so it's still misleading by omission. Now, what's kind of cool from a legal perspective is that the laws that prohibit that sort of misleading behavior, they're very broadly written. And the laws themselves say, yeah, something can be true and still misleading, and that's against the law. And so the laws themselves are designed to capture that sort of subtle greenwashing. And so hopefully that's a match, and hopefully there's some recognition there of the pattern of deception, because what we're seeing with our greenwashing databases we're building at Oxford is that this is going on all over the place, and there are thousands and thousands of examples of this misleading greenwashing advertising happening all the time from these companies.
question from a student that is actually quite interesting. So they ask, could climate litigation community go after politicians who intentionally mislead the public, and in particular politicians who are found to have received monies from fossil fuel companies? So I guess in the US that's probably a tricky issue in terms of like freedom of speech, but maybe US and globally, like can politicians be pursued for intentionally making misleading statements around climate if they were also on the books for oil companies, if that makes sense?
It's a really good question. Well, I'd have to think about it more before I gave a really good answer. My initial impression is that it might be very hard to
Yeah,
do that. A lot of these lawsuits are based on, a company selling something. It's selling the product. It's not just talking about the product, it's selling it. And so if there's nothing being sold, it's harder to sue,
okay.
essentially. And that's a limitation of the legal system. Um, I mean, it's even the case that these companies, when they talk to the government, they could lie to members of Congress about climate change, and even that's hard to
Mhm.
go after because again, they're not selling anything to a consumer there. They're just talking. So, there are limitations to the legal system as well, and that might be one of them. And that
Yeah,
might be something that, in journalism is better equipped to expose and try
okay.
to counteract.
Yeah. Yeah, investigative reporting on that. I guess voters, I guess, could keep
Mhm.
hold them accountable rather than the courts. Another question there, just to share some insights on lawsuits on behalf of youth, if this is an effective strategy or if there are examples globally where this has been successful.
Absolutely. So we've seen youth lawsuits in the US, we've seen them globally. There was a youth lawsuit at the European Court of Human Rights that, just as the court issued its affirmative opinion today on the Swiss case, it dismissed the youth case brought by youth in Portugal, but for technical reasons. It's because the youth didn't go through their domestic court system first before bringing it to the international court, and that's generally a requirement. So that was dismissed for that technical reason. But I think the principle definitely stands that you have this group that's particularly affected by the problem, and we've seen some successes in the U.S. The Montana um, court, state court, found in favor of youth, basically finding that not taking climate change into consideration for projects in Montana violates the constitutional rights of youth in Montana, essentially. So what we might see in the US is kind of this state by state approach of constitutional rights litigation around climate. There was also a ruling out of Hawaii that basically stated that there's a constitutional right to a stable climate in Hawaii in the state constitution there. So we might see this sort of developing across different states. That's what happened with marriage equality, gay marriage in the U.S. State by state first. Then it became more of a national thing. So maybe we'll see that as well in climate.
Hmm. So just the last question, and I'm not sure you'll be able to share all the information because maybe there's ongoing legal cases that you can't speak on or but the question is, have some of the expertise produced by the Climate Litigation Lab at the University of Oxford or work by you yourself prior to being at Oxford been used to support an argument in climate litigation? So I guess you can speak on general.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. That's partly how I got into this field is, I was doing historical research, doing my PhD at Stanford on what the oil companies knew and when they knew it. And I found, wow, this research is really useful for these climate lawsuits, and that's what got me interested in that area. And then I went to law school to learn more about that whole world. So definitely, for sure. And You know, we at the Climate Litigation Lab, you know, we don't take funding from law firms, but we interact with them, you know, all the time, and so it helps us understand what sort of trends there will be in the field, what kinds of research topics are going to be relevant to climate litigation currently and going forward, and things like that. So that's our mission, is to help inform these climate lawsuits as best as we can.
Yeah, and I guess over the next few years, out of any field, your field is really going to be, you know, changing rapidly and having a lot of really interesting legal cases to talk about, and that's very exciting. Ben, thanks for your time. It's great to have a chat with you here again. Thanks to all our listeners at Salem State. This is part of Salem State Earth Days week, so we've lots of other events taking place at Salem State. You can check on Salem State's website. Thank you, Ben, and thank you to audience, and we'll see you all at the next webinar. Okay, thank you
very much.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.